Thank you so much for this kind introduction and for the invitation. I hope to iterate my thanks to Dr. Berry, as well as Christoph Berry and the museum team, Jorge Lam, Carla Cavelti, Letizia Pelganta, and Maria De Signoli for making this visit possible with such kindness and generosity. And of course, I'm grateful to you for being here. I'm very much looking forward to discussing the work of Alexander Kluge together here tonight. I was particularly delighted by this invitation because the Kluge-Berry Workshop brings together, in many ways, several threads that I've been thinking about in my own work. In my current book project, I have a chapter on Giovanni Segantini and the intellectual community in which his work was produced and received. So necessarily, the fascinating presence of Peter Robert Berry II is sort of in the center of this milieu. At the same time, I've also been working with two colleagues in Berlin on an edited volume entitled Uncanny Environments. It was here, as well as through a combination of fortuitous events and film screenings, that I came into conversation with the incredible filmmaker, writer, philosopher, you could say polymath, Alexander Kluge. We had the honor of interviewing Alexander Kluge for Uncanny Environments, which is coming out later this year. And that collaboration has since developed into further conversations about, for example, Alexander Kluge's use of generative AI in his work, which is something I'll also be speaking about tonight. So these two projects then came more concretely together when last year in September, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to live in the Nietzsche house in Sesmaria as part of my research. Within my first days of arriving, I phoned Alexander Kluge. After all, this was an area that he had often, and he continues to travel to, and which he has also foregrounded significantly in his collaborations, especially with the celebrated German artist Gerhard Richter, whose work also appears in tonight's installation downstairs. The first thing Alexander Kluge told me on the phone was that he was in the middle of working on a collaboration and an installation with the Berry Museum. "You have to go to the Berry Museum in St. Moritz," he told me. The next day, I took the bus and arrived here at the Villa Arona, which is this really magical portal to another world, the world of these vivid paintings, these exciting encounters between art, medicine, and the history of this area. And since then, it's been just wonderful to see how the Kluge-Berry Werkstatt has developed and, importantly, continues to develop. I emphasize the development as ongoing because in this second iteration of the exhibition, Alexander Kluge and the Berry Museum are still foregrounding what they call a Werkstattcharakter, so the character of a workshop. This is in part to emphasize a sense of openness, which is crucial more generally to Alexander Kluge's philosophy of art, where to be unfinished is to keep the artwork alive, not to close it off, not to reify it. It's an openness to storytelling, to further expansion, further connections and associations, and in this sense also an openness to having you, my dear audience members, be part of this process, part of this exploration of the human capacity for association and expression, or in German Assoziationsfähigkeit und Ausdrucksfähigkeit. A review essay in the journal Art Forum from the year 2008 offers an apt description of why this open-endedness is in fact very much integral to Alexander Kluge's broader aesthetic philosophy. Alexander Kluge, I quote, does not want to impose sense, but rather to further the play of elementary immediacy in order that the sensual impressions people have might come to life. Privileging Sinnlichkeit over Sinn, so sensuality or sensuousness as in the sensorial, over making sense, Kluge implores his readers, and we could add viewers, not to obsess about meanings. Any attempt to interpret every piece in his new work would be misguided. To want to understand it all forsakes the more fundamental experience of spontaneity and pleasure in favor of intellectual mastery. As you'll see in this installation, there is a certain kind of elusive, playful indeterminacy in many of Kluge's works, and that becomes an invitation for the audience to make their own associations, to choose their own red threads and paths through his work. In short, to respond to these works both in deeply individual ways, and then by viewing these together, as we're now doing, also more collectively. Alexander Kluge's work has always taken on what I could describe as a kaleidoscopic quality, with many facets and fragments which remain dynamic and energetic in their refusal to coalesce into a static, overarching meaning or whole. But that's not to say that meaning is not there or that there isn't meaning behind his work, because importantly, kaleidoscopes are not merely a collection of fragments or shards, but rather these individual pieces come together to form different patterns depending on how you, as a user, rotate the scope. Kaleidoscope. That suffix, like telescope or stethoscope, to invoke the medical here, comes from the Greek skopein, to look at. And it should remind us that all of these patterns depend on our own subjective perception as viewing, feeling, breathing subjects. When preparations were underway a few weeks ago for this installation, I asked Alexander Kluge on the phone if one could speak of a binding theme in the exhibition, even with the kaleidoscopic quality in mind. And he replied, the human capacity for expression, die menschliche Ausdrucksfähigkeit. This is then a theme that necessarily thrives in plurality, that depends on the connections and relations we build between various objects, images, episodes, and themes taken, as you will see, from across history. In the following minutes, as a result, I'm not going to explain or impose a sense onto this incredible, truly, truly incredible exhibition here in the Berry Museum. Rather, I will offer a few possible points of entry, take up a few selections, and provide, along the way, some insights into Alexander Kluge's working methods, so his artistic process. To do that, I have chosen to focus on a few keywords, which are included both in the title of this event and in the written texts that Alexander Kluge has written and you will find interspersed among the video monitors. Thus, I will divide my talk into 3 or 3.5 parts. First, I will use the Longue Durée concept to provide some historical background. Then I will turn to a closer reading of one of Kluge's works in the exhibit, entitled A Digital Response to Berry's painting Aurora from 1907, after which I will briefly touch on how generative AI technologies are here deployed as, in fact, an extension of Alexander Kluge's conception of cinema. Finally, I will round off with my own suggestion for a way of thinking about these works, where, now taking up the installation's invitation to form one's own associations, I suggest, as a cultural historian of the late 19th and early 20th century, that the painterly technique we find in many of Berry's works, which is this divisionism technique, is not so far off from the kind of cinema put forth by Kluge himself. So my introduction to the exhibit will incorporate, in this sense, many of Kluge's own words within the exhibit, and I also want to take advantage of this time together to kind of quote some of his texts at length in the vein of a book reading or a poetry reading, to kind of foster that collective experience. And then some of my other remarks will draw from our recent conversations, as well as Alexander Kluge's earlier works and writings. And in the final part, I will humbly offer my own coda, one which I hope can also invite you to think alongside, again, that openness and plurality of stories, which is at the core of this workshop. So let's start with longue durée. Has anyone heard of this term before? Would somebody venture to offer a definition?
Long, hard.
Yeah. You can translate it. Yeah.
It's my ignorance in sense.
Well, yes, it absolutely does come from a French historian, not Alexander Kluge, but Fernand Braudel. But it's actually a term that appeared not too long ago in conjunction with the Engadin and Alexander Kluge's work. So thanks to the Engadiner Art Talks, Longue Durée was actually their 2021 theme, as some of you may remember. And there, Alexander Kluge contributed a short film entitled Une histoire quasi immobile. In tonight's exhibition, longue durée appears as a keyword that Kluge uses in one of the texts accompanying the films screened on the monitors. So Stichwort longue durée, as he writes, keyword, parola chiave. The term, as you will see, is brought directly into conversation with the legacy of the Berry family, as well as the Engadin topos more broadly. First, however, I might give a little background on this phrase itself, if you'll allow me to offer a brief philological or slightly technical historical digression.
The term longue durée is largely owed as a concept thanks to Fernand Braudel, a French historian known for his work with the Annales School of French historiography in the post-war period. So writing in the 1950s, Braudel's notion of longue durée began as an intervention on methodology, on how history was being written, talked about. Really, we can also say how it was being perceived. Fundamentally, Braudel sought to address how we understand history with regards to different temporal scales. History, as Braudel argued, wasn't always determined by singular, dramatic, big events. It wasn't, for example, one technology that started the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. In fact, to speak of industrialization as a revolution already sort of erroneously suggests that this was something closer to an overnight pivot, something that came out of the blue, when in fact it was a far more emerging process, an emergent process, something that resulted from the intersection of many variables, not just the steam engine, to offer one example that's kind of typical in history books. So Braudel suggested instead that we should try thinking of history as operating on three different temporal scales. So first he has what he calls events, événements. So that could be something like a battle, a landmark political decision, elections, significant deaths, or even like a sort of short-term regime. So these are short-term, usually experiences kind of singular moments or singularities. And then there are these kind of cyclical models that he calls conjoncture. It's a bit of an odd sort of technical term, and that's sort of a medium temporality. And it's usually cyclical and modeled in this economic sense of kind of boom and bust, growth and stagnation, developments one might find in trade, prices, consumption patterns, but also population fluctuations, demographic patterns. So these are things that usually happen maybe if you sort of step back a little further and you start thinking about maybe decades or more than a few years. And then finally, we have the longue durée. So this is long duration, and it's the underlying structure beneath these other scales. So importantly, this is the real undercurrent for historical change, though often it's on a scale that in the moment doesn't feel perceptible. So the longue durée could materialize, for example, as a gradual transformation in geographic or environmental conditions, climactic elements, or like long-term trade networks like the Silk Road, economic systems, social relationships, even sort of mentalities. And these are structures and infrastructures that may seem relatively stable, but in fact, they gradually reshape economies, technologies, cultural practices, affecting change also on those previously mentioned meso and micro scales. The movements of the longue durée often take on the form of a slow-moving progression. So in that sense, they can be thought of as more linear than cyclical. They are durational, playing out over time. And I'm emphasizing that because cinema is a durational medium. So this is also what the title of Kluge's earlier film, Une histoire quasi immobile, refers to, an almost immobile history, barely perceptible, yet nonetheless moving like a powerful tide under the surface level wave-like agitations of short-term events. So the intervention is that it's usually not just events that change the course of history or throw our world into a crisis. Those events themselves come out of much longer standing relations and developments and should really be regarded almost as secondary to the undergirding longue durée. So to just extend this idea across the three temporalities just mentioned, we might not always know if what feels like a sudden crisis today in the present is in fact just part of a bigger cycle of fluctuations and rhythms. And then those cycles happen maybe within a longer transformation, and that's the longue durée. Likewise, a period of inactivity, or something that we perceive as static, staying the same, could in fact be part of a much bigger change, if we now take up centuries or millennia rather than decades as our timescale. So that's why it's crucial that we move and think between these scales, Braudel insists, to find our bearings. I quote, "Whether you take 1558 or this year of grace, 1958, which is when he's writing, the problem for anyone tackling the world scene is to define a hierarchy of forces, of currents, of particular movements, and then tackle them as an entire constellation. At each moment of this research, one has to distinguish between long-lasting movements and short bursts, the latter detected from the moment they originate, the former over the course of a distant time. The world of 1558, which appeared so gloomy in France, was not born at the beginning of that charmless year. The same with our own troubled year of 1958. Each current event brings together movements of different origins, of a different rhythm. Today's time dates from yesterday, the day before yesterday, and all former times. So it's really important to hold on to the longue durée. Moments that we feel to be particularly decisive can also happen when these different timescales intersect or come together in a particularly fortuitous or unfortunate way. So rather than just this kind of seminal event, it's actually the event in conjunction with the medium-scale conjoncture, as well as the longer-term durée. What we call then big historical developments like the Industrial Revolution or desecularization depend on these kind of constellations of the stars coming together in a certain way at the right time and place. Okay, so that was Braudel. But I find it suggestive to think about the Engadin in this way, as a place where different scales of history often gather in significant ways, not just as intersections between people, but also their environment. Whether we take, for example, the visits of important cultural figures and politicians, kind of events, the generational development of Grand Hotel, the medical industry, tourism, the conjoncture, or this wonderfully looming landscape, which has so often been hailed for its particular light qualities, this crystalline air, which renders colors vivid even at a great distance. I would add, perhaps more speculatively than what Braudel is writing, that when these different elements come together, exciting things happen. In the case of the Engadin, philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche find their footing. Artists like Peter Robert Barry II find their calling. But this happens through that intersection between these different scales: landscape and geology, economic systems and global infrastructures, and then finally, the human actors and their own constellative intersections and meetings. So in the exhibit in the Berry Museum, Kluge also offers an account of this. As he writes, in the narrative of people and places, the story of the Badrot and Berry families in St. Moritz, starting with the regimental doctor Peter Robert Barry I, is not only about biographies and people. At the same time, the succession of generations describes an essential part of the development of the mountain resort of St. Moritz into a special center of the world, or a center in the world. In the turmoil of the 20th century, the towns of the Engadin are recognizable resting places all over the world, not only because of the two great world wars, which with their grand hotels, their communicative, economic, and cultural networks, are as individual as human beings. Places and people are always mirrors of the times. So, another important temporal model to think about alongside this one that we kind of take and slightly reappropriate from Braudel is suggested by Kluge as the push and pull of what the ancient Greeks called chronos and kairos. Do these terms ring a bell at all? Yeah? Okay. So chronos is linear time, sequential, chronological, right? Durational and flowing. Kairos, on the other hand, is an interruption in that flow of time, like a slice or a form of punctuation. And it is a term that often has political resonances as well, as the time to act quickly, to make a decision. Kairos in ancient Greek meant the exact or critical time, so the proper time for action. And Alexander Kluge's film company is kairos as well, so that's a word that you will find a lot in his work. Kluge's work reminds us that, especially with the seeming abstractness and ungraspable quality of time, there are actually corresponding pictures, myths, stories that give expression to these models of temporality. In his discussion of the longue durée in this exhibition, for example, he retells the stories of allegorical figures and deities who incarnate such ideas. And I think his words are worth quoting in full, so they're included in this printout here that you have on your seats. According to ancient mythology, the primordial god of time, called Saturn or Kronos, devoured his children. He was unable to consume his son Zeus, the founder of the later Olympian order, only because Zeus's mother, the goddess Rhea, who represents planet Earth, forced a beam into his throat, preventing him from biting down. That which extends from Saturn, also known as Kronos, through the aeons up to the present, namely linear time, governs the cosmos, evolution, and all the processes of development, including our heartbeat and the rhythm of our veins, arteries, and capillaries. But the myths also tell us that at the very end of the age of the gods, in the twilight of the gods, so to speak, Zeus begot one final son, a tiny demon and deity named Kairos. His name is synonymous with the fortuitous moment. In every respect, he stands in opposition to the eternally and mechanically rushing current of time. He evokes the image of a lightning flash. He dances on a knife's edge, whereas Fortuna, or good fortune, dances on a ball. A forelock, or a lock of hair, drops over his forehead, and whoever seizes it is fortunate. The back of his head is bald. Whoever fails to grasp this lock of hair in time will slip away or lose their footing.
This late-born, last son of Zeus has always existed. We humans are ancient creatures, and the same holds true for all living beings and for nature. A certain vividness, vitality, liveliness dwells within us. So this text, which was originally written in German by Alexander Kluge, uses the word vividness in English and then translates it as Lebendigkeit. So let me reread that last part, which switches from those concrete allegorical representatives and figures back to the emotional and the subjective. Kairos has always existed in us living beings. This then is the second important thing to note about Kluge's aesthetic philosophy. Both models of temporality are inextricable from how we experience the world, deep down as individuals, but also together. This is the subjective world of experience that Kluge also has explored throughout his entire work, and especially in his earlier attendance to feelings, to chronicling emotions. And note here that the term chronicle is of narrative importance, but it also has chronos, time, at its center. As both a writer and filmmaker, Alexander Kluge hopes that we can work with a medium like cinema or television or even computers to tell stories which help us become aware of our agency as active rather than passive historical subjects in time. So cinema arguably gets special attention because it's a durational medium. But other media can do this too. Written narratives are driven by that forward push as we skim words in a linear sequence and become absorbed in the flow of Chronos, so much so that sometimes there is a risk we lose our sense of Kairos. This is Kluge's concern, to make sure that both are at work. What is important for art and the artwork is not to entrap the reader or viewer within that flow, to entrance them in a way that they lose themselves, and with that, their own sense of time and historicity. So Hollywood movies, for example, are said to never release the viewer from that grip of suspense. These are Kluge's words. Since that smooth narrative plot so often holds its public wrapped to the story as a kind of total immersion or even escapism where we forget ourselves. And then we return to our daily lives and there's no connection. Whereas what that very same medium can do, and now I'm going to quote the Kluge scholar Richard Langston, is cinema can enable viewers to perceive and reflect actively on the passing time and the making of history. But for this experience to occur, any given medium must create spaces within itself where the viewer can discover kairos, the time of opportunity. So end quote. These media must give the viewer that instant of freedom to choose. That's Kluge's phrase. And there's a range of possibilities of what that might look like. So often it's something we actually associate with modernist strategies of the avant-garde, kind of shock effect of cinema. And in Kluge's case, and some have called him the last modernist, this often takes form through an assemblage of fragments, which importantly avoid a kind of monumental totality and instead thrive in this plurality, playfully jumping from one image to another, from one written vignette to the next, and producing kind of rhyming consonances or also dissonances between these montages, or within these montages. And what's important for Kluge's understanding of montage, which is the cinematic technique of assembling and editing together images, is that it shouldn't be obviously didactic or telling you what you must think or what the obvious connection between these two things is. So in Sergei Eisenstein's October, there's a famous sequence where he shows different kind of objects representing God, and it's cynical. What's important is that it encourages you not only to be aware of your position as viewer, but as a thinking, feeling subject. This is why Kluge in interviews doesn't refer to himself as the Socratic midwife. So traditionally, by asking certain questions, they pull out that corresponding correct idea in us. Rather, he describes his position as a consultant to the midwife, or midwife consultancy. I quote, "One must radicalize Socrates. People are their own midwives. I provide midwifery counseling or consulting. Hebammenberatung. Good authors are the ones who tap into our Stone Age brains, into all the stories stored within them. Of course, this only works if people want this to happen. They must be willing to cooperate." So in that sense, to go back to this montage principle, there's also a kind of resonance with the more structural question that we had encountered with Fernand Braudel as a historian's question. How do we grasp the longue durée? How can we anchor ourselves, find a point of incision in time's flow that allows us, for example, to become aware of our historicity as subjects, to deeply feel our place within it, and to imagine better futures? And one possible answer is by moving between scales, by looking to these points of encounter and to those constellations. And so, as Alexander Kluge will tell us, there's one simple form that can do this, and that's storytelling, especially storytelling in plural ways that invites further stories and retellings. So you don't just stop at the end of the book, you then keep going. For we might remember that in German, the term Geschichte, for history, does this fascinating work of combining history with narrative, with story. Geschichte is also a story. And in English, his story has also been kind of deconstructed in interesting ways. And in the Berry Museum, as Kluge now writes, the kinds of stories told and represented do exactly that important work of knitting together different historical subjects, our presence and our pasts, so that indeed we might be able to grasp something like the longue durée. So now I'm going to quote also at some length. "The simplest narrative for longue durée is the generations, the stories told in families. This touches me just as much in Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks in Lübeck as it does with the Berries in St. Moritz. My own family branches out through the ages, with its origins in England, the Ore Mountains, France, and my hometown of Halberstadt. It's an incredible number of voices from my ancestors. That is why it is right that we constantly re-examine the words chronicle and feelings, and rediscover the delicate alphabets that lie within time, chronos, and emotion, empathy, or objectivity. The pictures in the Berry Museum touched me in this regard, and I like to respond to them. Pedro Robert Berry II died in 1942. I was 10 years old at the time." So I want to also point out how this passage brings together not just the aspect of time, but also very importantly, emotion. The pictures in the Berry Museum touched me, Kluge says. And here he's not drawing attention to his position as filmmaker or auteur, but rather as somebody standing before the painting who's taking it in and then is moved, reminded of his own histories and others too. So note how already here multiple family histories are being knit together. Kluge speaks from a deeply personal place, referring to his own family history, his birthplace, his family tree, but he also notes a structural similarity, or we could say a kind of formal similarity if we speak of form now as intergenerational storytelling, with Thomas Mann's fictitious Buddenbrooks, and then of course the history of the berries. For this reason, you'll also find in the exhibit a lot of references not just to Dr. Peter Robert Berry II, who made all these wonderful paintings, but also his father, Dr. Peter Robert Berry I, who Kluge finds particularly fascinating given his position as a historical subject in the midst of the 19th century Crimean War and also the history of St. Moritz and its development. And then I would actually add that there's something also similarly very magical. I'm also going to come back to that term. When you go through the permanent exhibit on the ground floor and you hear the voice of Dr. Peter Robert Berry IV in the audio guides in your ear, it's this really wonderful moment of kind of intergenerational work. So obviously we cannot speak of the temporality of emotions without thinking about space. So apropos walking through the galleries. To go back to then this passage, the parallelism that is being drawn here is also striking because, as Kluge so often does, it has material, sort of fleshy correspondences. For one, he notes that he was alive when Peter Robert Berry II died, meaning that in many ways, we're not so far apart at all. Secondly, and this is something that is not made explicit here, but is thematized in many parts of the installation, all of these historical actors, Kluge, Berry, Thomas Mann, have this landscape of the Engadin in common. They were all here in the flesh at different times. But by now we should know that the present is anything but singular. So Kluge says when he looks at the paintings of Peter Robert II, Berry II, he's moved and that he likes to respond to them. One example so far of a kind of response is here, where the story of the Berries is linked to family trees, both historical and fictional. In other words, this one family becomes part of a bigger constellation, which then grows and extends in different directions and offshoots, taking us to distant lands, places, historical moments, fictional and documentary, imagined and real. Another response to Berry's paintings takes form in these short films featured throughout the exhibit on various monitors. Here, Alexander Kluge will take, within the film, one or several of Berry's paintings and essentially riff on it, kind of like in the musical sense of a theme and improvisation. So he'll show the painting, then subsequent digital reinterpretations, which are done with assistance of this AI program, Stable Diffusion. And then those variations also are accompanied by other historical images, quotations, or further remarks that emerge kind of from this work of prompting. So I've taken up here one example, which is the film Aurora, which initiates a dialogue with Berry's 1907 painting Morgenröte, or Dawn. So I'm going to play maybe the first 2 minutes just so that we can get a sense of what's happening here. And then I'd be curious to hear from you kind of just what sticks out to you. What are your impressions? So that was a good place to actually kind of stop and think about the film. So yeah, just going through it now a bit more slowly, kind of just structurally, what the format is that you'll see in a lot of the works. You have first the original picture and then various close-ups. And then you start to get these kind of digital variations, which, as you mentioned, are also being kind of influenced and modulated by certain keywords that Alexander Kluge puts in. Sometimes he's also responding to what the kind of program puts out. And they have very different textures, but also this kind of question of lighting remains relatively consistent, which is very interesting. And then occasionally you'll kind of get a reminder of the original image. So again, talking about this kind of like not settling in or understanding that there's a kind of juxtaposition at work here, this montage principle. And then we get this poem from, it happens to be from Baudelaire's Fleur de Mal, which is a section of the poem about dawn. So there's a kind of thematic correlative there. When debauchees are roused by the white, rosy dawn, escorted by the ideal which gnaws at their hearts through the action of a mysterious, vengeful law, in the somnolent brute, an angel awakens. And that's kind of interesting also because the German translation is done by Stefan Gorge, who is a symbolist poet. And historically, there is a kind of kinship between Segantini and Berry, who are often grouped into a kind of symbolist work with their pantheistic imagery and kind of spiritualist themes. And then poets like Baudelaire and Stefan Gorge, who didn't intersect historically, sort of didn't meet, but there's a kinship there for sure. But another kinship that I kind of couldn't not hear was this opening of dawn as a reference to one of the most famous Homeric opening lines or epithets in the Odyssey. So, when young dawn with her red rose fingers, this is a line that repeats as an opener several times, marking a new day and a new beginning. And indeed, now we find a comparison which takes us back to this world, albeit by another route. An image of a historical object follows, a Greek vase with horses. This is a traditional representation of Eos, as Kluge notes, the goddess of dawn in ancient Greek mythology. Every day, Eos drives her horse-drawn chariot to herald the breaking of the new day. So what Kluge is doing here is reminding us of this iconography in multiple ways. Dawn is thematized both more literally and physically and climactically in the landscape, but also symbolically in the horse-drawn chariot. And then it's invoked, of course, in the painting's title. And then he takes those elements further, elaborating, building on them. The next image, for example, reverses the comparison. So Engadin's mountains are now inside the ancient Greek iconography rather than ancient Greek iconography within the mountains. Importantly, dawn is here. We're drawn attention to the fact that dawn is here a figure of hope, of constancy. It returns to guarantee renewal. So tomorrow is another day, a kind of fresh start. We know that dawn will rise every day, whether we see it or not. And this is the only reliable thing in turbulent times. Die einzige Verlässlichkeit in zerrissenen Zeiten, as Kluge writes. It is comfort, it is solace. But as it comes to us anew, it offers something like another chance, another moment, pregnant with possibility, with action on our part. So Kairos and Chronos once again intertwine. That combination of Kairos and Chronos is also what Kluge identifies as the magic element in these images, both in Berry's works and in earlier dialogues with artists like Anselm Kiefer or Gerhard Richter, who are here similarly anchored in the material landscape and spatio-temporal specifics of the Engadin. So I would like to quote now another passage from one of the leaflets, which is accompanying the exhibit, where Kluge discusses his work with Gerhard Richter, and he says that they're connected by the fact that they were both born in central Germany in February 1932. This is fortuitous timing, striking again. I quote, "These pictures are about magical realism. This magical realism is particularly evident in photographs that Gerhard Richter has subsequently painted over. The magic here, both in Kiefer and Richter, and in my opinion, also in Peter Robert Berry II, arises from the incorporation of time in its various elementary forms into these images." One element of magic is based on the intertwining of eternity and the moment. Longue Durée and the beating of life in our souls and bodies together form the element of time. They permeate each other. Magical realism is based on the fact that both are real at the same time, and not just one of them alone. So in his filmic response to Berry's Aurora, the images and variations follow one after another in a linear durational sequence. But many of the frames also feature another kind of juxtaposition, one of horizontal overlapping. So this is where Kluge very intentionally puts up the original painting on the same frame, encouraging the work of juxtaposition and comparison without kind of blending them together into a total synthesis. It's what one scholar, Chris Gerard, calls a multi-image. I quote, "It allows the audience to become an active intellectual participant in the cinematic process through watching, combining, and contrasting the image layers. They can see beyond the ordinary limits of perception," end quote. So that understanding of cinema as provoking kind of critical thinking and viewership through montage, through formal experimentation, has been played with by many of the greatest auteurs. So Jean Epstein, Dziga Vertov, Maya Deren, Hollis Frampton, Jean-Luc Godard, to name a few. But Kluge likes to take this idea slightly further as a philosophical concept, not limited, in fact, just to the techniques of the camera or the editing room. If this form of cinematic viewing and meaning-making lies within the spectator, we can say that our capacity for cinema was in fact part of the human experience from the very beginning, that it existed thousands of years before the first cameras were ever invented. Kluge calls this pre-technological cinema the virtual camera within us, Kopfkino, so the cinema in your head, our own production of images when we daydream, when we sleep, images that we think of, that we conjure, images we turn to in difficult times as a shift away from the harsh reality of the outside world. And all of this can be told in the moment of birth, Kluge writes. Here, that idea reappears in his use of the aurora theme. I quote, "In Latin, dawn is called aurora, and in ancient Greek tradition, it is called eos. Even in today's turbulent times, this feeling of sunrise is renewed with every newborn child, who, like a blank slate, expects the world to treat them well." End quote. As soon as the child is born, it is confronted within the first few seconds of life with the painful sensation of cold, for example. The infant then begins to dream of a warmer situation. In other words, the child imagines a different world that is being longed for, a kind of utopian feeling. And human beings continue to produce these feelings throughout their lives. This is something Kluge really talks about a lot in his earlier works. And his production of feeling allows them not to escape into pure fiction, nor to magically transform the world around them, but instead to hope, dream, and produce wishes that prevent them from resigning themselves and from giving up. And so here I'm actually drawing on some work I've been doing with a colleague at the University of Liège, Jérémy Amer. And we have this quote from a text from the 1980s where he refers to this original capacity of producing utopian bifurcations, kind of diverging from reality, as the cinema principle, which he claims is much older than cinema itself. I quote, "Since the Ice Ages, or perhaps even earlier, streams of images and associations have moved through the human mind, partly for anti-realist reasons, as a form of protest against an unbearable reality. This is the cinema that has existed for tens of thousands of years, to which the technical invention of the negative, the projector, and the screen merely responded. It is a particular intimacy with the viewer and with experience." For Kluge, then, cinema can be seen as the technical realization of a human disposition to produce and associate images, something that dates to the origin of humanity. This is what endows also cinema with a kind of a genuine political efficacy as well. Our spirit of utopia lies in what Kluge calls these mixed forms which lie between document and fiction, between fantasy and a sense of reality. Because the real or documentary on its own could compel fatalism or resignation in difficult times, like what is referred to in the Aurora film.
But fiction on its own offers only a fleeting utopian escape. And so we need both. We need these forms that mix both. And this is something we can also talk about more after, but that's why Alexander Kluge thinks of AI image tools as still within this kind of virtual camera principle, because they produce these kind of hybrid images that are somewhere between kind of reality and the dream, the surreal. And he actually says, like, it will become boring and not useful when these programs get so good that we don't have glitches anymore. So we can talk about that work process more. This is from he's published a book recently on his work with AI in both German and English. So in the last minutes, I want to suggest a possible parallel between, on the one hand, what I've been describing here in the exhibit and in Kluge's writings, and on the other, the painterly technique, which lies in some ways at the heart of Berry's work. Here is a close-up of the images we looked at earlier. I won't say which is which, but one is Berry's Aurora, and the other is the digital reinterpretation or commentary, which was produced by AI after the original image was taken and put into Stable Diffusion, along with a couple of keywords. The close-ups are more or less at the same scale, but as you can see, the textures are pretty different. Can you tell which is which? Which one's Berry? Which one's AI?
Right one's Berry, left one AI.
What do you think?
I actually was the opposite.
Interesting. Okay. Other thoughts? So here's the answer. So yes, which is super interesting because it's kind of like, we'll talk about the technique in a second, but there's almost like this pixel digital quality, and that has to do with the divisionist technique. So the image on the right is the original. What the AI version hasn't reproduced is this distinctive technique, this distinctive application of brushstrokes and colors, which is associated with the divisionist movement that Berry was also in conversation with. The AI texture is actually much more conventional. It kind of emulates a gradient below the texture and then the kind of simulation of brushstrokes on top. Whereas on the right, the colors are not mixed together, but rather placed side by side, blue next to red, pink and yellow, not faded or blended into each other by the artist's brush. And then when they're viewed from a distance, this has the effect of a real vibrancy that, in fact, is actually quite hard to reproduce even in the photographic versions of Berry's works. You really have to see it in person to get this full effect. It's almost cinematic, kind of animated, pulsing movement that the brushstrokes do for us. So this technique of painting chromatic hues side by side rather than mixing them on the canvas is a hallmark of the divisionist painting style at the fin du siècle, with which Giovanni Segantini and then later Pedro Robert Berry II were both associated. You can also see how later Berry plays around with it even further, going for brushstrokes which aren't just those kind of precise stitches, but rather these bigger sort of swathes of color. And the driving concept behind divisionism, and interestingly, one person in this circle, Vittore Crubici, was also thinking about, he was using scientific theories and experiments in optics at the time to kind of propose this technique in painting. But basically, it consists of dividing, that's divisione, right? Divide or break color into these separate, pure chromatic components so that the bright hues are placed side by side in thick, stitch-like brushstrokes according to their complementarity. And then, this is the important part, it's up to the viewer's retina to mix those hues into dimensional forms at a distance. For Segantini and Berry, this was a technique seen to be especially helpful for portraying the kind of vibrant luminescence of the Engadin and that naturally bright, almost blindingly vivid, colorful landscape. Or, as Adrian Stocker puts it in a recent book on Pedro Robert Berry II, the question arose as to how nature could be reproduced authentically, unadulterated in painting. Segantini came to the conclusion that mixing colors had an undesirable effect on the quality of the light and lighting, causing a loss of that crystalline clarity and luminosity and causing the colors to fade. They therefore had to be applied in thin strokes
side by side and unblended, unmixed. When viewed from a certain distance, the different colored strokes can then no longer be distinguished from one another, and thus the colors are only mixed by the retina of the viewer. This was a technique then that Berry was very much struck by when he learned about it from Segantini, especially given his own background in medicine. He writes, following a visit to Segantini's atelier in 1899, "Suddenly I understood what the master meant by vibrazione dell'aria, vibrations of the air. Segantini explained his divisionist painting technique to me, explaining how he had managed to capture the atmosphere of the mountain heights by breaking down the colors and applying them on the canvas as unmixed, as unblended as possible." And then he adds, and I'm including this as more to comment on the content of the paintings, "With the way humans and animals are so simply and naturally integrated into these works in their relationship to nature and the world, into the monumental splendor and grandeur of the mountain world, I cannot help but be reminded of Homer." So a Homeric reference actually appears in Berry's own words too. It's a nice tie-in to our earlier discussion, but also more broadly an example of how Berry, in reacting to Segantini's paintings, is kind of exercising his own capacity for associations and expression. So he's reminded, he says in German, unwillkürlich, sort of almost unconsciously, of Homer. And that taps into that kind of unconscious element that, seen from the perspective of the Longue Durée, could be said to connect ancient Greece to the Engadin. But I also wanted to include this reference for another reason. Namely, I would venture now to suggest a bit more playfully that in a certain sense, the divisionist technique can be seen itself as emblematic of Kluge's approach, to now put these two in conversation slightly anachronistically. In Kluge's works, the juxtaposition of images is meant to provoke and interact with our virtual camera. Similarly, the divisionist painter puts the colors next to each other without mixing them up to avoid this kind of traditionally illusory realism that you get with chiaroscuro, with blending, with shadows. Yeah? And instead, the painter asks the viewer to do that combinatorial work, to then have the full picture come alive on their retina, in their own sense perception. Thus, you will find that the kaleidoscopic images and texts in this exhibition space are similarly juxtaposed, rather than premixed, to offer a predetermined sense of what's really happening or a kind of imitation of reality. Rather, they await the viewer, the spectator, you, to take those images and combine them for yourselves, to spark that vividness within us. Thank you. Thank you.